our next speaker deserves an award for the one who's traveled the furthest to get here from the great country of Israel, Dr. Benjamin Bailey.
Good. Thank you, Larry. So good afternoon. Before I introduce myself and say a few words from where I'm coming from and to speak to you today about this topic, in a nutshell, I will say that men who live with an abusive female partner are a significant part, which is often overlooked, of a bigger phenomena of intimate partner violence. And it's a very difficult topic for most people to speak about, let alone be persuaded that this should be acknowledged. And therefore, it's an easy topic to ignore, and it has been ignored, as all of us in this room know, for already 50 years since the beginning of research in the field in the mid-70s. So in my next 25 minutes, I will do my best to work through this difficulty and hopefully make it clear that the longer that we'll keep on ignoring women's violence and abuse, the further that we'll remain from helping individuals and families in this field. And I come here today with two hats. I'm more than 10 years ago, I and a few other social workers have founded By Your Side. In Hebrew, it's Letzitchem. It's a non-government Israeli organization that we founded to help men in distress. And I'm today serving as the chairman of the board. And this is how we got to know Ed and Larry. And thank you for inviting me to speak. My second hat is as an academic researcher. I'm a faculty member in the criminology department in the Western Galilee College in Upper Northern Israel. It's a peripheral college with about 50% students, both Jewish and 50% Arab. This is where I'm coming from. So it's a little over 28 years that I've been working as a clinical social worker. I started my work in working with abusive men in a very innovative hostel set up by the Israeli Welfare Ministry. And very often I would hear men saying to me, listen, Benny, it's okay that the judge has sent me here and the student, I've pushed her, but she threw her cell phone in my face before I pushed her. And so it's okay that I'm here, but why isn't she here, my wife, in the next room, also taking an anger management course or intervention? And it sounded like a solid question. And it took me some years and more of an experience to gain more confidence and dive into that world. So I've worked with men and women as perpetrators and as victims. My PhD was the first systematic research in Israel about women's abuse and violence in heterosexual relationships. I've also worked with children exposed to parental violence. And for already 15 years, I'm occasionally serving as a court-appointed expert in parent-child reunification cases, in issues of contact refusal and parental alienation, and also write danger assessments for men who are accused or suspected of behaving violently. So my fields of research for the last 15 years have been domestic violence, child maltreatment, and masculinity and fatherhood are topics that I've picked up along the way. And so when I came here, because all my career has been in Israel, I was thinking that is the Israeli case comparable to the US case. And obviously there are different local differences in culture and demographics, etc. But there are also strong different characteristics which make America and the case of Israel, just as any and most other Western egalitarian countries, that both Israel and the US are democratic societies. The gender equality is embedded in the institutions. There are strong women's organizations in Israel, and there are domestic violence laws for over 35 years. Israel was one of the first countries to pick up on these laws. There's mental health services, and it's a multicultural society, as the American society is. And this last point, meaning that there are always groups and communities and minorities that are more traditional and could say more patriarchal in their values and ways of life, and there are also very egalitarian communities, minorities, and families in the country. So why is it so difficult to acknowledge women's violence and abuse? I think that when we think of femininity and masculinity and things like violence and dangerousness and vulnerability and victimization, it is almost natural and cognitively and emotionally to associate victimization and vulnerability with women, and violence and dangerousness with masculinity. And while women's victimization is easy for most people to envision and to believe, it's difficult for most people, unless they've encountered it personally, like people in this room have mentioned before, or through a friend or a son or a father. It is difficult. It's a difficult one to persuade people, and there's a lot of disbelief. Whilst women's victimization is always, and for good reasons, seen as a big deal and alarming and not a funny issue and safe to support, men's abuse is not a big deal. It's not alarming. I haven't come across more than 5 people in my career from the welfare or the police department who spoke to me about abusive men in an alarming way. And it's always something that men could bear, and there's no rush about it. Often it's funny, as we all know, and it's also risky to support. I could see the faces of people when I was telling them what the conference is about here in Washington and New York before I came here, and you could see what goes in people's minds when you just talk about men's equality, and there's always a suspicious kind of way, whether I'm a misogynist or I'm a reactionist or I'm a male that finds it difficult to reposition himself in modern times, etc. So, and while we know that for women who are victims of partner abuse, it's a shameful issue, but there's a wide legitimacy for them to speak about it. And for men, it's obviously also shameful, but there's a very limited legitimacy for men between them and themselves to acknowledge them and seeing themselves as victims. We know that from research, let alone speak about it to their friends, families, and even professionals. So it's just a counterintuitive story. And this is why our work is so important. And we should just keep on doing it like we all understand, hoping things will change. As for empirical research, one of the basics of empirical research is that you should keep it as clean as possible from ideology and from intuition. And it's amazing for me to realize how difficult it is to accept research findings in this field, because studies across cultures have shown that interpersonal violence isn't a gendered problem, but it's a human problem, definitely more so than a gendered problem. And though most violent behavior is executed by men, it's usually, as we all know, against men. And the case of domestic violence is, again, a different story from all the other, from street violence or different areas of criminality. So it's a human problem. And many among both genders experience partner abuse. And it's important to realize, help me out here, Larry.
Just click the screen. That happens, I think.
Hmm.
There you go.
And it's not a competition, because often we hear, well, who gets murdered? It's women getting murdered, and we never hear about this. And if we'll acknowledge women's abuse, there's a budget issue, and we lose budgets for women's services. So it's true that the cake might or will be divided into more pieces, but these are all people and citizens and people who have a problem that we have to address. And it's not a zero-sum game. Talking about men's abuse doesn't rule out whatever we know about women's suffering from abusive men. And often I've written a book this last year, and it's called The Other Side of the Pain, Men Living with an Abusive Female Partner, which I hope to be done translating into for English readers by early summer. And when I'm presenting the book in Israel to professionals or other places, I'm often asked, so what are you saying? The men's violence and women's violence is a similar and identical thing? Well, no, the answer is no. We all know that. But when you think of the spectrum of aggressive behavior, from the passive aggressive side to the most extreme side of severe violence and let alone murder, it's true that men are more murderous, they're more frightening, and they're more physically injurious. This is true. But most partner violence isn't an extreme. On the contrary, most of it is not even physical. It's mainly emotional and verbal, and it's bidirectional. And when there is physical violence, it's mostly moderate of shoving and pulling, etc. And the extreme cases where men obviously are more dangerous, it's true, but that's not the big story. And when we concentrate on the very extreme, we're losing out on the masses who suffer from this phenomenon. Whereas the similarities are many, so the predictors of what would make a girl or a boy be aggressive or a victim in intimate relationships, the predictors are the same, and we know that it's basically exposure to adverse child experiences. Personality disorders are similar of people who abuse and behave violently. The types of violence that both men and women use are different from the stereotype are pretty similar, and the motivations are similar. Socially, it should be said that, for instance, women in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Israel or Arab women in Israel, when you come from a traditional community, the cultural dependency and the financial dependency obviously put women in greater risk. So we know that if you're financially independent, it's easier for you to walk out of abusive relationship. And for instance, for Orthodox religious women, if there's abuse of husband, it's more difficult to step out of these relationships than for a secular Jewish woman. The reality, male and men victims, well, obviously, again, similar is that many men reporting depression, anxiety, social withdrawal, and PTSD. These are the most common outcomes of abusive relationships. What is unique for men is that the shame is deeper. We as boys were socialized for independence and winning and leading and being mentally resilient. So to be in a position where when I'm abused and or harassed by my wife is very shaming for men, and it's a deeper hole to come out of. And there's profound loneliness with men. We all know that because of what I've said before. Men don't share, and fathers in cases of separation and divorce are in higher risk for losing contact with their children, and so the whole issue of loneliness. And also the skills of creating social networks is in average different between men and women. So men, again, find themselves in this context with confronting deeper loneliness. The issue of legislative abuse, and particularly false allegations, I won't go into it, but it's been discussed today. But from my experience, and in my book, for instance, the first chapter starts with 10 cases to explain to most people who cannot fully imagine what it's about. False allegations, according to my experience, is the hardest and toughest issue to come out of in such relations because it takes time. Usually it's sexual allegations and physical allegations. And if my wife, God forbid, if we get into a nasty divorce and she'd argue or say that I've showered our daughters in a sexual way when they were 5, it would take me 4 to 5 years to clear my name. And I would not see my daughters for months, if not years. And I've came across dozens of cases like that. So false allegations is a big and tough one to stand up against. And we know that women file much more than men. And obviously, as we all know, limited services. Professionals very often don't know how to deal with men in distress. In general, the psychological world is a feminine world, and many therapists do not know how to talk to men and speak to men, and more specifically in cases of abuse. I will just say, maybe I'll go back to that, but maybe I'll start with this example. I've encountered a father who introduced himself to me a few months ago, and he's written a booklet about 5 meetings that he had in the welfare system about custody evaluation. And he calls it Rachel and You, and that's about 5 meetings that him and the mothers had with this social worker. And the third meeting, he decided to tell her about the abuse that he's experienced, and he writes the following. I came into the meeting anxious. Would she believe me, that social worker? Would she think I am manipulating, exaggerating, that it wasn't really violence, that it had nothing to do with our custody case? With shaking confidence, I told her how abusive my wife was over the years, and I expected her to ask questions, but Rachel didn't ask anything. Not a word, not a glance. She stayed silent, her face expressionless, writing briskly. When I realized that this was how it was going to be, something inside me cracked. And in that moment, it felt safer to end the story and the conversation as quickly as possible. This is a very, very common situation, I'm sure, here as in Israel, as in other places, that if you switch the gender and you think of a woman describing being abused by a father in a custody meetings and the custody evaluator not mentioning it, not asking it, and the ending chapter is that his abuse wasn't even mentioned in any report. So this is a very common reality and troubling one. So, oh, going back to in 5 minutes. So the process of ignoring women's violence, because I think it's definitely a lose-lose situation. So when the diagnosis is partial, it's like going to a doctor and asking him, "Listen, please only look at my left side and don't look at my right side before you." Okay, it's illogical, and this is what happened. And women and men come to the welfare or before the court, and women's abuse is overlooked, and women have a sort of a legitimacy to go on with how they behave, and men are supposedly re-educated, and that jeopardizes the healing of families, let alone children, who the risk is unacknowledged when a mother is unregulated and abusive or violent, and this carries, we all know, severe consequences throughout their adulthood. It's also a counterproductive message that hinders the efforts to reduce family violence as a whole in the society, overlooking women's share of intimate violence, and the double standard in policy and the gender bias that we are all aware of in courts and in welfare systems obviously weakens men's trust in government, and that's a big issue and a risk for social cohesion and the belief of men in the institution. So, to conclude, about IPV, it's a human, not a gender problem. Women's abuse should be taken seriously and addressed equally apropos gender equality. The overlooking of women abuse, in my eyes, is sheer professional malpractice, and it's easy to understand that when we overlook men's abuse. So it's just, in my eyes, from what I've seen with children and with families and men, this is sheer malpractice, and this is how I think this should be framed. So for policy, welfare, and law enforcement systems, there's room for a refreshed perspective that is based on research, academic research. To conclude, in the bigger picture, I just want to say that I find the denying of violence against men in the context of anti-male wins or a zeitgeist that arguments about patriarchy and male privileges, violence against women, sexual harassment, and traditional masculinity as toxic are very common, whereas in reality, most men are not that privileged. Most men are not CEOs who work in fancy offices and boss around people in the 30th floor, but rather people who get up in the morning, usually before the children, and go into the cabin of a truck or into the infrastructure and technical infrastructure of all our lives, and they're not that privileged. And women have privilege too. It was very apparent in Israel in the hostages cases when the elderly and children and women were the first to return and men were the last to return. And it was accepted by everyone as something that is just not 50-50, not equal, and for a good reason. So privileges go in both directions and are not an exclusive male issue. Most men, according to research, by far are not abusive and are not violent. And in traditional masculinities, there is often a lot of beneficial things. Again, with the case of the war in Israel, on October 7th, there were 350,000 men in the day putting uniform and twisting their life and becoming warriors. And that was functional and that was needed. And that had to do with the upbringing of boys and the ability for boys to be resilient and to dissociate, because you need to dissociate when you come from your regular life and suddenly you're a soldier and you're a warrior and you have to go into a war zone. You need to dissociate, and that's functional. So emotional dissociation is not, again, only a bad thing. Lastly, we all know that men value family, and most men are loyal and do a lot of sacrificing and want their wives and their children to be pleased and well off, rather than, like Ed said, control them and be coercive, and as the patriarchal stories go. So to end, Like IPV, gender equality is not a one-sided story. Gender equality and shifting social expectations are confusing for men, and many men find struggle and are lost. And it's not a funny thing and it's not pathetic, but the world has changed dramatically in the last 50 years in the relationship between men and women. And women are more independent, they're more selective, and can have a life, a full life with children, family, career, and everything without the permission of a man, and that's fine. But most men need to reposition, and a lot of men don't know how to do it, and they need guidance and help, and in a more compassionate way. So the state of American men and fatherless homes is known to you just as it's known to me, and men's well-being is a neglected field. So men are not okay, and what we teach boys is a big issue. I've asked this question often in Israel and in Germany when I was just there in the sabbatical, because I have two girls, and the number of times that they come home and they said that they've had some kind of activity with girls empowerment numerous times, and that's fantastic. And I always ask my friends who have boys, how do they empower the boys? What do they tell the boys to do instead of only what not to do? And they always look at me and perplexed. It's a good question, and it's a good question apparently in Germany and in Israel, and I've heard that in the States. So, what's the desired pathway for men is under discussed. So, in order to thrive, we all understand we need a more compassionate rather than blameful gender discourse. Thank you very much.